And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Good afternoon. I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist John Cowen with your marine forecast. We'll start off taking a look at sea ice across our offshore areas. As you can see, there's still plenty of open water across much of the Alaska coastline. Some shore-fast ice starting to develop and thicken across the immediate coast. However, we do expect that there will still be plenty of liquid water offshore over the next several days. The strong winds are going to keep things fairly open across much of the North Slope. Looking at tonight's weather, a low-pressure center in the southeastern Bering is going to slowly weaken over the next day or so as a stronger system moves up from the south. However, we do have strong winds across much of the southwestern quadrant of mainland Alaska, getting up into the northern Gulf of Alaska, and plenty of mixed wintry precipitation along much of the coast as well. Getting into Wednesday, our low-pressure system moves up from the North Pacific. This one's a 968 millibar low, so reinforcing those strong winds across much of this area. High pressure over the eastern Gulf of Alaska is going to keep things relatively calm in this area. However, we do have a weakening front that'll be stationary over this area, continuing to produce precipitation. Looking into Thursday, now the low continues to deepen to 967 millibars just south of Kodiak Island. Very strong winds expected across a very large swath of the Gulf of Alaska and portions of the eastern Aleutians. A front extends up into the northern Panhandle, reinforcing the precipitation across much of the area, and strong winds now start moving into the Panhandle for Thursday. Let's take a look at our marine forecast. So Wednesday, we're not expecting anything too strong at this point. We do have some 35-knot winds start moving up into the Ketchikan area. Seas up to 16 feet there. However, much of the rest of the inner portions of the Panhandle there staying relatively light, 10 knots to 20 knots out of the south, 2 to 4 feet. As we look offshore from Sitka, winds are going to generally be out of the east to even northeast, 15 to 20 knots, seas about 15 feet or so for most areas. And then looking at Tuesday's forecast, now we see these Thursday rather, stronger winds starting to move into the Gulf of Alaska. Looking at 30 knots out of the south now, seas picking up above that 15-foot mark, moving towards 20 feet late in the day. Inland areas looking at winds out of the southeast, 25 gusting even 35 knots, seas picking up to about 5 to 10 feet for most areas. And then looking at Wednesday's forecast for the northern Gulf of Alaska and Cook Inlet, you can see we have 30 knots out of the south across much of the Cook Inlet, 5 to 10 foot sea, or rather 6 to 10 foot seas for most areas. And then offshore, we're looking at 30 knots out of the south, seas around 15 to 20 feet for most areas. However, we get into Thursday, those strong winds start to move in with that system moving up from the North Pacific, seeing 45 to 50 knot winds just offshore of Kodiak Island and south of Seward, seas increasing up to about 20 feet or so there. And then across Cook Inlet, still around 30 knots to the west of Fairbanks, seas about 9 feet there, but very strong winds as we get towards the southern Cook Inlet, 45 knots out of the northeast with seas pushing up to 15 to 20 feet. Taking a look at our forecast for the Alaska Peninsula. Wednesday, generally lighter winds, 25 to 30 knots or so for most areas. Seas in that 6 to 8 foot area for the Bering Sea. Offshore in the Pacific, looking at 10 to 15 feet. And then again, looking at Thursday, those stronger winds, mainly going to be south to southeast of Kodiak Island, but we do have some stronger winds that are going to be coming across a weakening front over the eastern Aleutians here. So winds generally around 25 to 30 knots or so out of the northeast, around Cold Bay, seas 8 to 10 feet in this area. And then generally, as you can see, our low pressure center with the winds generally becoming out of the northeast for Kodiak Island, around 30 to 40 knots or so, seas 10 to 15 feet. Farther west, you can see that weak front that we have for Wednesday, still pushing about 35 knot winds out of the northwest with seas around 15 feet for most of the area. That area of stronger winds moves off towards Cold Bay and Unalaska for Thursday. Weakening trend from the west with winds around 20 knots, bringing seas down to about 8 to 10 feet. For the southwest coast for Wednesday, expecting 20 to 25 knots out of the north to northeast. Seas generally 4 to 6 feet for most offshore areas here. Thursday, a weakening trend continues. Generally out of the east to northeast, winds about 15 to 20 knots, seas coming down to about 2 to 4 feet. And then finally across the North Slope for Wednesday, we do have some very strong winds that are going to persist for the next day or so. So expect 40 knot winds, seas about 10 feet across much of the Beaufort coast over to Utqiagvik. As we look towards Cape Lisburn, winds turn more northeasterly, around 30 knots, and seas increasing to about 8 to 10 feet. And then for Thursday, that weakening trend does start across the North Slope. Winds still 30 knots out of the east, About 7-foot seas, what we're expecting across much of the North Slope, and then that stronger core of 30 to 35 knot winds offshore of Wainwright, producing seas of about 4 to 6 feet. And that'll wrap up our marine forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowen.